My name is Darcy Smith. I am a physical scientist with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. This is the Planning and Scoping module of the Air Toxics Risk Assessment course. Now that you've seen the big picture of risk assessment, we'll talk about how to begin and what you need to know to conduct your risk assessment. Common questions that should be answered during the planning and scoping process include: what chemicals are emitted, where are they emitted from, and what resources in terms of time, money, and people can be devoted to this risk assessment. These questions must be answered, and that's why we plan and scope out an assessment before we begin any analysis. In this module, we'll describe the overall process of planning and scoping for an air toxics risk assessment. This will include answers to questions about why planning and scoping is important, who is involved in it, how it is done, and what products are developed. Let's go back to our big picture roadmap of the process of performing an air toxics risk assessment. As you can see from the picture, the planning and scoping step encompasses the entire risk assessment process. We use the planning and scoping step to decide up front what we are going to do in the analysis, why we are doing it, how we are going to do it, who is involved at every step along the way, and what products we expect out of the process. Good planning and scoping means no surprises at the end of the risk assessment process and ensures that the assessment will meet management's needs. Here you see a 5-step process for planning and scoping that we will go over in the next few slides. Remember that because planning and scoping is the first step in the overall risk assessment process, everything done in the risk assessment is informed by the decisions made during planning and scoping. In that sense, planning and scoping is a deliberate process because you deliberately perform this function to inform the rest of the assessment. Planning and scoping is also deliberative in that you must first get together all the people who need to be involved in the analysis and discuss why and how the assessment is to be done. This is a critical element of planning and scoping, since you want everyone to clearly understand before the analysis begins in earnest the reason the study is being done, who needs to be involved, how it is going to be done, and what they can expect once the study is complete. There are significant benefits to a rigorous planning and scoping process. Let's review what some of them are. Number 1, a key benefit is that its stakeholders understand the process up front and see that it is assessing their concerns in a sound manner. They are much more likely to accept the answers. Number 2, for other interested stakeholders that are not involved in the formal planning and scoping process, good planning and scoping will make the results and how you got them more acceptable. Number 3, while these stakeholders may or may not accept the results of the analysis, you will be in a better position to explain how and why the analysis was done the way it was. Number 4, another critical purpose of planning and scoping is to ensure that the analysts know what is expected of them with regard to collecting enough high-quality data to answer the questions that the assessment has set out to answer. Number 5, it is a waste of everyone's time and resources and a waste of goodwill among stakeholders to perform a long analysis only to find out that your data can't answer the questions you set out to answer. So exactly who do you think participates in planning and scoping? The answer to that question varies from study to study. The group can have a narrow focus or a wide focus, but in all cases, the planning and scoping team must include the primary end users of the data, the key risk managers, and the technical team that is going to perform the analysis. Additional participants can include public officials, citizens, other technical experts, industry representatives, and so on. To decide who is on the risk assessment team, it is also important to consider the overall purpose of the assessment and any legal requirements. The risk assessment team must have a common understanding of all of these items, including the assessment questions and the data needed to answer those questions. The team must also understand the methods to be used, each team member's responsibilities, and their expectations. Once we've identified the concern and who should be involved, we need to identify the scope of the assessment by putting specific limits on what we are going to study. To do this, we start by identifying and putting answers to an initial set of specific questions we want the assessment to answer. The assessment questions help to identify the sources and chemicals to be included in the assessment, and the physical area included in the study. To define the scope of the assessment, we also answer these questions. Do we only consider inhalation exposure, or do we conduct a multi-pathway assessment as well? What are the potentially exposed populations? What health endpoints do we want to assess? These can include cancer and non-cancer endpoints and chronic and acute exposures. We must also document our exact rationale for each of our decisions. We want our overall risk assessment process to be transparent, so we need to document the how, what, who, and why of every step of the process. The product of the scoping step is a very specific statement called the problem statement that states what you perceive the problem to be. What exactly is it that we are concerned about that has caused us to go through this process? Along with the problem statement, you should also state what you are going to do to evaluate that concern. When writing a problem statement and your overall plan of attack, you need to be as specific as you can. Nebulous problem statements will lead to nebulous answers. We can also include statements about what we are not going to study, just so that everyone is clear from the outset the scope of the study. Ambiguity in risk assessment is a bad thing. Take the time to be explicit about what the concern is and what you are and are not going to study to evaluate the concern. Throughout this class, we will be following a hypothetical facility through a risk assessment. Here's an example problem statement and overall study plan for the example that we will explore further in upcoming modules. Big Air Industries is a hypothetical facility. The first sentence of the problem statement tells us the potential problem. The second sentence tells us what we're going to do about it. The next two sentences provide more detail on how the assessment will be conducted, modeling, the exposure pathway to include in the assessment, inhalation, and the population to include in the assessment, those outside the facility boundaries and within 50 kilometers of the Big Air facility. Finally, we explicitly say what we will not include in the assessment. That is, we will not be including non-inhalation exposure pathways. Now that we've identified the scope of the assessment, we need to answer the question, why is there a problem? We're going to draw a picture to answer that question. For example, you think there's a problem with inhaling air toxics in a particular place. Draw a picture that shows how you think the air toxics are being released, from where, how you think they might be getting from the point of release to the point where people can breathe them in, and the kinds of health effects that you think might result. We call the picture a conceptual model because it is our concept of what happens in the real world when air toxics are released to the air from a source. You've seen this picture before. This is our generic drawing of some of the things that can happen in the real world when air toxics are released. For a specific study, you would draw a similar drawing, only you would put names and locations on the facilities, identify the specific chemicals of concern, locate and name the populations, identify the exposure pathways, and so on. In addition to your diagram, you should have an accompanying narrative that would describe all of this in more detail, because pictures can sometimes be ambiguous. The narrative statement would include all the points covered by the diagram and listed here. By the time the conceptual model development is done, which includes both the picture and the narrative, everyone involved in the risk assessment should have a clear picture of what it is you are going to study. Together, the diagram and the narrative statement constitute a formal conceptual model of what we are concerned about and how we think is physically happening. The conceptual model is our guidepost for exactly what it is we are going to study in the risk assessment. It is important to remember that the conceptual model is not a static model. As we begin to collect data, we may find that we have misdrawn our concept of reality. Note that the risk assessors do not revise the conceptual model in a vacuum. Everyone on the planning and scoping team should be informed if a modification is made to the model. They should also understand how that change affects the overall assessment strategy. So now that we've identified what we want to study, the last step in planning and scoping is to figure out how we are going to study it. In this last step of planning and scoping, we develop an analysis plan that lays out how we are going to study the process that we have drawn in our conceptual model in order to answer the assessment questions we've identified. The analysis plan matches the elements of the conceptual model with the appropriate analytical approach. Here are some critical elements of an analysis plan. It is worth noting that the initial analysis plan does not have to answer each of these questions in complete detail. The initial analysis plan may state that various work plans will be developed to perform various tasks, and that those plans will lay out the detail necessary to complete the task, along with schedules, team responsibilities, costs, quality assurance, and quality control requirements, and so on. Here are some additional questions that need to be answered and documented in your analysis plan. You can refer back to these slides when you develop an actual analysis plan in the future. One of the critical questions that often needs answering has to do with balancing available resources with your assessment wish list. Often, assessments are going to be constrained by resources, and you will have to make some decisions about how to do the best assessment with limited resources. For example, you may have to pick whether you do a modeling study or a monitoring study. Therefore, it is important to have the risk assessors and risk managers interact during the planning and scoping process. There's not a correct answer to balancing assessment desires with actual resources. Study-specific circumstances will dictate what you do. It is important to document what you choose to do and why you choose to do it. You will probably need to refer back to this decision later in the process, so it is important to maintain good documentation along the way. To summarize, good planning and scoping is critical to developing a good risk assessment that will answer the questions you want answered and encourage buy-in from stakeholders. The main products from this step are explicit statements of what you think the problem is, what you are going to do to study it, pictures and written descriptions of how you think the problem may be physically occurring, and the exact details of how you are going to study the problem. Finally, the entire process is not static. You may cycle through the planning and scoping of an assessment, possibly many times, as you learn more information. Now we're going to talk to one of the engineers here at EPA about a risk assessment that he needs to have conducted to support one of his rules. Hello, I'm here with David Putney, an engineer at the Environmental Protection Agency. He is responsible for a project involving big air industries. So he's going to tell us a little bit about the facility today as part of our planning and scoping module. Hi David, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome, Darcy. Thank you for having me here today. The hypothetical Big Air Industries is a really interesting facility, and I'm happy to talk with you about it.
So what does Big Air Industries do? What do they make, and where are they located?
Big Air Industries is located in Smallville, North Carolina. This facility is located in an office park complex, but there are some residential communities nearby. The company makes widgets at this facility, and in turn another company uses those widgets to make gadgets.
So why do you need a risk assessment conducted?
This facility currently has 3 emission release points: 1 emission stack, 1 raw material storage pile, and 1 storage tank. Business is really good right now, and the company would like to increase widget production. But in order to do so, they need to add a second storage tank. So in order to better inform our decision as to whether to allow them to build that second storage tank, I would like to know what the current risk situation is.
Okay, so you might need another risk assessment in the future with the second tank, but for now you just want the baseline situation.
Yes, at this point I'm just interested in the current risk situation.
Okay, who's going to be making the decision whether or not to allow this new tank to be built?
My manager will make that final decision. However, I should point out that some of the residents of those local communities have also expressed an interest in the outcome of this risk assessment.
Okay, so we'll need to set up a meeting with your manager to be sure that the assessment produces results that will properly inform the decision. And we should probably ask at that meeting the best way to involve the community in this process. Does this facility have an air monitor nearby?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, so we'll invite someone from the monitoring group to the meeting, and they can tell us what data the monitor is collecting and if we can use that in our assessment. And we should probably also invite someone from the modeling group in case we need to conduct modeling as well. What pollutants does this facility emit?
Well, this facility emits some metal compounds, including arsenic, cadmium, and chromium, as well as some other chemicals, including 1,3-butadiene, benzene, and naphthalene.
Okay, so it sounds like we'll be focusing on the inhalation pathway, but I'll go ahead and invite a toxicologist to our meeting just to be sure. What's your schedule for this assessment? When does it need to be completed?
Well, we would like to respond to Big Air Industries within 6 months. So, if I could get the results of this first risk assessment in 3 months, that should give us enough time to evaluate our options and to conduct a second risk assessment if it's needed.
Okay, that sounds reasonable. I'll check with my manager to be sure we have the resources available to support the project. So I think we have a good start here. I'll set up a meeting with our managers and someone from the monitoring group and a modeler, as well as a toxicologist, and we can get together and flesh out the details and develop a conceptual model and then an analysis plan that we'll share with the group. Is there anything else you can think of at this time that we need to discuss?
Not at this time.
All right. Well, David, thank you for your time today to explain the need for this risk assessment and to tell us about Big Air Industries. We'll be following this hypothetical facility throughout our risk assessment process and through future modules.